GreenRoots is a community-run nonprofit organization advocating for environmental justice in Chelsea and East Boston. And Maria Belen's view of justice has been shaped by her childhood in poverty-stricken Nicaragua, and as an organizer in migrant communities in the US, work that she continues with the student immigration movement. She holds a master's degree in public policy from Tufts University's Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning Department, and oversees GreenRoots environmental justice campaigns and representation in broader grassroots alliances like the Green Justice Coalition in the greater Boston area, as well as national movements for environmental and climate justice. So today, Maria Belen is going to tell us about GreenRoots' work and its priorities for federal action on climate change. Thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to hear your presentation.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me. So should I share my screen? Can you see that?
Perfect. Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Great. So thanks for having me. My name is Maria Belen, and I am the Associate Executive Director at GreenRoots. And even though we don't know each other, we are connected through a river and a community that I call home. If you've ever wondered where road salt comes from, fresh produce, home heating fuel, well, at one point they were stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek and across our community. So Chelsea, at just 1.8 square miles, is the smallest and second most densely populated city in the Commonwealth. We have over 45,000 residents, 73% of which are ethnic minority, the majority of which are Latino and Latina like myself, who came here from Nicaragua, and 24% live below the poverty level. In neighboring East Boston, we have over 55,000 residents who live in 5 square miles, although 3 of those are occupied by Logan International Airport. 53% of East Boston residents identify as Latino and Latina, and 17% live below the poverty level. Now, GreenRoots is a resident-led environmental justice organization that is working to engage just regional benefits, while shouldering the burden for land, air, water, and noise pollution that comes from those very same industrial activities. 100% of the jet fuel that's used at Logan International Airport is stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. 70 to 80% of the region's home heating fuel is also stored on the banks of the Chelsea Creek. 400,000 tons of road salt that are used in over 350 communities in the Northeast are also stored along the banks of the Chelsea Creek. Chelsea is also home to one of the largest produce distribution centers in the country that brings in thousands of trucks daily, contributing to our air quality. Now, Massachusetts, despite its progressive reputation, has some of the most profound race and class disparities. In 2016, the Center for Effective Government graded Massachusetts and only one other state an F for exposing communities of color and folks living below the poverty level to hazardous facilities. Our communities have some of the highest rates of strokes, cardiovascular disease, and asthma hospitalization in the entire state. And we could sit back and allow these disparities to happen, or we can organize, and we've chosen the latter and have had some pretty amazing victories. In 2006, we learned that Chelsea's diesel exhaust level exceeded the EPA's threshold by 20%, and that our expected cancer cases were 500 times higher than the rest of the state. So together with the New England Produce Center, we applied for $3 million to replace or retrofit 132 dirty diesel engines. And by doing so, we eliminated 2,000 tons of air pollutants annually. We improved our public health, and we reduced healthcare costs. Now, I can't see all of you, but I would ask you, if we were in a crowd, how many of you have heard of Cape Wind? And maybe many of you have heard of Cape Wind, but it was the very same proponent that was proposing clean air for Nantucket, that was proposing a dirty diesel power plant for the banks of the Chelsea Creek, and across the street, our only elementary school complex. So when GreenRoots got wind of that proposal, we organized immediately. We notified the community, and we utilized every single tactic in the organizer's playbook. We mobilized, we wrote letters, we testified, we intervened in legal procedures, and eventually we were successful in defeating the proposal. And so now children like my own, Maya, who is 6, and Ana Victoria, who is 3, can play in this very same playground without breathing in the fumes of a dirty diesel power plant. And so now we're engaged in a similar struggle. We are organizing against an electrical substation that's proposed to go on the banks of the Chelsea Creek on the East Boston side, in a very densely populated neighborhood of East Boston, majority low-income folks, majority Latino, non-English speaking. And if built, the substation would go next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel and adjacent to a heavily utilized playground. And so these are the kinds of proposals that we think are a direct threat to our community. And not only poor planning, because the parcel of land is not only projected to flood, but has flooded many times in the past. But really, this is a type of infrastructure that is the example of environmental racism and of climate injustice. And this is not the type of infrastructure that we should be building for resiliency. And we know that this is what could happen if something goes wrong. So we know that COVID-19 has disproportionately impacted low-income communities and communities of color across the country. And that is not different from Massachusetts. Chelsea has been the hardest hit community with the highest infection rates. We have almost over 5 times the state average of infection rates. And we know that that's in part due to the social determinants of health, such as transit and housing, but it is also due to the historical burdens that our community carries when it comes to industry and when it comes to an environment. So even though we're the hardest hit, our community, our partners, and the city are working very hard every day to respond to the pandemic. And we will keep working hard to address public health inequities and to improve our quality of life. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Belen. That is, it's a very daunting set of tasks ahead of us and our shared community. And I wonder, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, and then I'd love to open it up to the room. One of my questions is, how can organizations like Citizens Climate Lobby, which is focused on federal sort of action at the federal level, how can we best partner with GreenRoots to protect communities of color and low-income communities who are just so disproportionately affected by this problem that we're working on together, climate change?
Yeah, I think the best way to partner is to work closely with grassroots organizations like GreenRoots. And so when we are fighting the substation, one of the things I didn't mention is the proposal was pre-approved in a process that had no language interpretation. And so even though we mobilized our residents and we went to the hearing and we requested interpretation was not provided for the residents. It was only provided for the board to understand if there was somebody who needed to speak Spanish. So for hours that residents were there trying to understand this project that's going to go in their neighborhood, they didn't understand a word because there was no interpretation. So in these processes that happened usually in the middle of the day when folks are working, usually in downtown Boston, this is at South Station, at the DPU, this is when we need our allies to show up for folks that can't show up, to show up for residents that have to work 3 jobs, that have to pick up their kids. So being an ally is responding to the needs of the community on the ground and responding to the calls to action and saying, we need folks to show up on this time. We need testimonies, we need bodies, being able and willing to stand up when folks don't have a voice. So I would say that's one example. Another example is when it comes to policies, following the lead from, again, folks on the ground. So I think at times there has been tension. There has been actually a lot of tension between traditional climate and environmental activists and environmental justice communities. And some of the reasons for that is that some of the policies that would maybe reduce carbon emissions, or that would reduce, let's say, emissions in the transportation sector overall, some of the policies would actually be more harmful to EJ communities, to low-income communities and communities of color, that it might create more concentrated pollution in hotspot areas like Chelsea. So when we're looking at national policies or regional policies, we really need to be listening to the folks on the ground, because some may say that a carbon tax or putting a price on carbon is a good idea, but if it's a regressive tax where the folks that are making the least amount of money, the folks that are poor, working class, have to pay a greater percentage of their income, that is not a progressive way of addressing the climate crisis. If we are getting revenue that is not going to be invested in EJ communities, that's really going to go maybe to electrical vehicles, those are not the solutions that our folks need, and those are not the solutions that are going to get us to addressing climate justice. I feel like I mentioned a couple things that I could expand and talk for hours and hours, but those are just like a few examples of some of the ways of folks to be allies.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. This is, I think all of us here really want to do our part to help, our neighbors in Chelsea and East Boston. And this is so important for us to, get a sense of how best we can make ourselves useful and protect environmental justice communities as we go about our own work, as well as in parallel. So I just want to open up the floor to anyone else who has any questions for our expert guest here.
I have a quick question. Thank you so much, Maria. When I was listening to everything you were saying, and I was thinking about the what you said about what doesn't help is talking about electric vehicles or regressive taxes. And I think we had CCL had an intern a couple years ago that worked with some social justice organizations to try and kind of help social justice organizations understand that the CCL bill would really benefit low and middle income towns and individuals. And I guess I wonder kind of what do you think is the best way to kind of reach out to people to given that it's a national plan, but to help people realize that this seems very far away, but at the same time it's something that would hopefully really help Chelsea and the population in Chelsea.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think what I usually, I'm from Nicaragua, and I grew up with folks from the US coming to Nicaragua to learn about the revolution and to try to figure out how can we help Nicaragua. And I remember folks in Nicaragua saying, go back to the US and figure out how you improve your own communities, how you connect with folks that are the closest to you. Because we got students from the Northeast who went all the way to Nicaragua, but had a hard time addressing equity in their own region, had a hard time going to Dorchester, going to Mattapan, going to Chelsea, going to East Boston. And so, not to say that you shouldn't travel the world and learn about what's happening in Latin America, but I think what needs to happen is that people need to connect with the organizations that are doing the work on the ground in their own communities. And so, when I talk about the solutions that are coming from the grassroots, and when it comes to carbon emissions and reducing emissions, it's not that we're against electrical vehicles. We would love to have, electrical vehicles, but our folks can't afford it. And so if there was a policy solution that addressed carbon emissions and made it accessible for people to have access to those, that would be great. But what would be even better is to improve the way that folks are moving around already. So investing in our public transit system is our #1 priority when it comes to transportation or reducing carbon emissions in the transportation sector. So when we think about policy solutions like TCI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, which is a regional initiative right now, as an environmental justice organization, we don't believe in climate in market solutions. We don't think that playing with the market is actually going to reduce emissions in a robust way. But if TCI is going to happen, we need to fight for those resources to be invested in the infrastructures that people already rely on. And so in the public transit, in making public transit more affordable, more accessible, cleaner, in electrical buses. So those are some of our priorities. I think one is getting in touch with folks that are the closest to you, that are doing the work on the ground in your community. And then 2 is really following the lead from them on what are the policy solutions, because we may say, well, those are global solutions, those are regional solutions. But we have the answers for those regional, statewide, and national solutions. We're working very closely together with partners of the Climate Justice Alliance, which are a national coalition of grassroots organizations working to address the climate crisis across the entire country. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I just quick follow up, if that's okay. I just wondered. So, do you all? Is there much discussion or conversation about a national plan or a national initiative for climate change?
I mean, there's a big hype for the Green New Deal. Sometimes I feel like we're always negative. We're a little bit critical of how the Green New Deal came about. It was supposed to be rooted in communities. The folks in indigenous communities and Black and brown communities across the country don't feel like it was necessarily rooted out of our communities. But there's a lot of proposals in the Green New Deal that really do address equity and address the climate crisis. But again, our solutions are more localized. That's the area that we have the most power in our municipalities, in our region, and in our state of Massachusetts. So those are the areas that we're trying to create the most impact.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Belen. I think, it's so important for us to educate ourselves on how best we can support the people who are on the front lines of this crisis and of the continuing pollution that our economy has produced for the past, 50, 100 years. I just have a follow-up question. How can we best keep ourselves informed about how to show up and turn out to be allies in this work? Is there an email or a website that we should go to?
Yeah, definitely. You can sign up for our email list on our website. It's greenrootschelsea.org. You can also send me an email and we can add you to the list. That's usually the best way to know what's going on. You can also follow us on social media. We have a lot of calls to action. We completely pivoted to a COVID response because our community was hardest hit and because there's such dire need when it comes to access to food, access to medicine, access to some of the basic necessities. So we've been responding to the crisis more so, but now we're starting to sort of go back to what are our bigger campaigns for environmental justice and transit justice and access to food and all of those. But I would say our website, our MailChimp, if you want to get on our email distribution, our social media, yeah.
That's fantastic. I just want to open it up again. If there are any other questions?
Yeah. So showing up at meetings and what are some of the other ways that people can partner with you?
Yeah, it depends on the campaign. Sometimes it's calling your representative for, let's say, the environmental justice bills that we're trying to pass, which is really codifying some of the basic definitions of what is an environmental justice community, what are the basic requirements for outreach in communities that don't speak English. So it could be sending a letter to your legislator. It could be calling the Secretary of Energy and Environment. It could be, I think the issue when it comes to legislation and policy is that we're always having to fight for environmental justice, and what creates a bigger impact is if everyone is fighting for environmental justice. And so if we have folks in Western Mass, folks that are not the most impacted, calling their legislator saying, you need to pass this. This is the time we need to enact environmental justice legislation. That's where a lot of the real support that we need comes from, is folks that are following the lead and saying, we're hearing that this legislation is about to get passed. We need the support from your representatives and legislators. So it could be writing letters, making phone calls, showing up to meetings, providing testimony, attending a rally.
That's awesome to hear. These are the kinds of actions that CCL members are well practiced in doing, and I'm excited that we can plug in and assist in some of those opportunities. And I hope we can build some partnerships going forward with everyone keeping up to date on how we can best be of assistance.